Welcome back in, everybody, to Sports and Money Pro Football GM. It is a privilege to have you back on with us today. Some of you already saw a video that we posted earlier in the week about the Raiders and kind of an 8-point plan. I didn't plan on 8 points, but that's what there were. 8-point plan to kind of try to help the Raiders organization out. Listen, it's so much fun to just sit here on the sidelines and do this stuff. When you're in a job position and you got the pressure on you, it's not as much fun, especially when you have a lot of voices inside the building screaming at you and outside the building screaming at you. But it's a lot of fun to sit here and talk about it, and I love every minute of it, and I appreciate you guys, all of you, coming in to explore some of it as well. In the last video, the 30-minute Raiders video that we did, we just kind of did an overview, 8 different things I wanted them to do. Today, we're going to kind of settle in and look at head coaching candidates for the Raiders and who all they might bring in. As usual, there's a long list of people that you could take a look at. And with most of them, you know, the question is, can they even head coach at all? In most cases, most of them have not ever been a head coach at any level, much less at the NFL level. And so you're going to find that with all of them. But we'll start off here with Jim Harbaugh, because he's the name that seems to be the biggest and that we've already heard connected to the Raiders, especially because the Raiders have just let go of their head coach and because Harbaugh is going through a few issues there at the University of Michigan with the NCAA. So we'll start with Jim Harbaugh and why I wouldn't do Jim Harbaugh, and then we'll start working our way through some of the other candidates as well. But again, the problem with most of these candidates, not all of them, there's a couple that do have head coaching experience. The biggest problem with most of them is we haven't seen them do it. And if they're good at it, they usually stay at the place that they were good at it, right? Harbaugh's kind of the exception to that. Most guys, if they're good at being a head coach, they stay there. They don't become available somewhere else later. So always a question with any of them. But let's start working our way through it. First of all, Jim Harbaugh. And for anybody who likes Jim Harbaugh, that's totally fine. Wants him to be the Raiders head coach, that's totally fine. There are things to like. You know, I love the fact that he's coached in the NFL before, that he won on the NFL level before. I can remember him coaching with the 49ers, I forget, 6, 7, 8 years ago, something like that, and watching that team just grow and watching that team be so physical. I remember specifically kind of their coming out party, if you will, against the Saints in one playoff game there in Candlestick Park, and it was just remarkable because the Saints were a legit Super Bowl contender in a lot of those years as well. It was remarkable watching the 49ers just out physical the Saints in that game. And then, you know, eventually later that season or the season after, the 49ers show up in the Super Bowl. And so there's a lot to like there with Jim Harbaugh. And he has coached there before, and he's won. And he coached at Stanford and won, which is very difficult to do. And, you know, sign stealing allegations notwithstanding and all of that circus that's going on there at Michigan right now, he's done a good job at Michigan. And you say, well, you know, some of those good records might have been because of the sign-stealing allegations, and that's possible. But even if you look at Harbaugh at Michigan before the alleged incidences started happening, you still have a coach who's doing a solid job, and he's still winning consistently, even if up until that time he wasn't winning big. So there's a lot to like there with Harbaugh. There really is. I could go deeper into that, but Harbaugh, and this is one of the reasons why I would stay away from him if I were the Raiders. Not all the NFL franchises. As a matter of fact, there's some franchises I would like to see Harbaugh come in and coach. But the Raiders, just to me, aren't the right fit. And that really starts with Harbaugh being just an outsized personality. I don't even know if he intends to be that, but he has become that over the years. And just that big persona, I don't really feel like that's something. If I'm inside the Raiders organization, if I'm inside the Las Vegas building and I'm putting together the short list of candidates that we really want to make a run at, Harbaugh's the guy I'm going to steer clear of. And the big personality is number one. You look at the Raiders over the past few years, obviously with the Gruden stuff, but you look at the Raiders over the years, say 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, the personalities that have come through haven't always been great for the organization. And instead, there's just been a lot of strife, a lot of weirdness, a lot of malfunctions, a lot of dysfunctions. And I really think it's time to just try to bring in somebody that's going to be all about winning, all about football. just not that big personality. And along with that, and again, I don't know if this is something that Harbaugh himself can help or not. It's just who he is. Anytime Harbaugh is at a place, not only the exits seemingly kind of messy, potentially here at Michigan, definitely in San Francisco, but even while he's there tends to be a lot of just things going on, things that aren't smooth, things that aren't streamlined. And again, for a Raiders franchise that has been in disarray and just been up and down with all kinds of just nonsense of their own, I don't know that I want to bring Jim Harbaugh in for that. And again, I'm not trying to rip Harbaugh here. There are other organizations I would recommend that they take a strong look at bringing him in. But the Raiders have just had enough of that. I mean, it's time for them to bring in somebody who's just going to focus on winning and hopefully be very good at it. And while I do think Harbaugh could establish a winning culture there for 3 or 4 years, I just don't know that those 3 or 4 years aren't going to provide so much rockiness and so much more circus that you've already had in Las Vegas. And then who knows about a messy exit that Harbaugh seems to kind of always have looming over his last couple of stops. I just don't know that I want to try to bring that into the Raiders organization again, even though there are things to like about Jim Harbaugh. So that's my feeling. For those of you out there that like him and want to bring him in and want to bring him into the Raiders, totally understand it. It's just somebody that I would take off the list personally, because I think if you're the Raiders, you need to settle things down. You need to start getting things back a little more professional, a little less circus. You want to get things back to winning focused and people who just know how to keep quiet. I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean you go over and hire somebody from the Patriots. That's not what I'm suggesting. But it wouldn't hurt to have a little bit more quietness in the front office and in the head coaching position. A little less drama, really, I think is what you might need here for the Raiders. If you're the owner, Mark Davis, and you want to make big splashes and big moves, you'll do that when you win. Whenever you start winning games, you won't have any trouble being on the front pages, so to speak, the front headlines of the internet. You won't have any trouble playing in prime time. You won't have any trouble selling tickets or jerseys or etc. All of that will come if you can get back to the winning. And so making the big splash or the big move or the exciting thing, that just cannot be the focus, because it, in a lot of cases, tends to really bring back a lot of just circus stuff, a lot of drama, a lot of chatter, and you want to calm all that down, I really think, for this next head coaching hire. So for me, I take Jim Harbaugh off that list, excuse me, for the Raiders. Now, so who would you hire, Ben? Well, I'm glad you asked, because I've got 2 guys that I really strongly recommend that the Raiders take a strong look at. One of them is a guy that I recommended they look at a year and a half ago when they hired Josh McDaniels instead. So, but the guy I'm going to talk about first is the guy that at the moment, I'm the most excited about. And again, it might just be flavor of the month, so I don't mean to fall into that trap, but this is the guy, and that is Ben Johnson. Ben Johnson, offensive coordinator for the Detroit Lions. I just really like the work he's done there in Detroit as the OC over the past year and a half. Now, again, if you dial the clock back 2 years ago, most of us wouldn't be very familiar with Ben Johnson's work. He just hadn't had a lot of major responsibilities in the football franchises, most of that being with the Dolphins and a little bit with the Lions. But as you watch, and this is really what I like here for the Raiders and for Ben Johnson, his work over the past year and a half in definitively upgrading that Lions offense. They already had Jared Goff in 2021, and that year they finished, I think, probably number 22, 23 in the league in yards per game. And they were even lower than that. I think maybe 25, 26, somewhere in there in points per game. I think it was 18 and a half points per game. Anyway, wasn't good. It was a very slow offense, and that contributed heavily to Dan Campbell's awful first year there. And listen, people say, well, Jared Goff's improved so much. Yeah, a lot of that's been under Ben Johnson. And listen, we saw him win some there we saw Jared Goff win some with the Rams under McVay. And yet we kind of heard when they got Super Bowl time, Patriots players saying, hey, we're not too worried about Jared Goff. And then a lot of people assumed when Goff gets shipped out from the Rams that's kind of it for Goff. Not too many people send him up to Detroit. They'll use him for a couple of years as a bridge quarterback, then move on. Well, that's not what's happened under Ben Johnson's tutelage there as offensive coordinator, with a very good offensive line, but not a ton of offensive weapons, especially in 22. You've watched this Lions offense just blossom and blossom and blossom. Yardage all over the place. They're basically top 5, top 6 when it comes to yardage, top 8, something like that. And then the points haven't been quite as good, but still averaging 25 points a game as an offense. I think they can do even better. The personnel's a little bit limited. They're still trying to work in Gibbs and Montgomery and still trying to work in the tight end. They're getting there, but it's not as if they have the best weapons on offense in the NFL to work with. And yet Ben Johnson really, I think, has just done a tremendous job there on offense. Now, what are the downsides to Ben Johnson? Well, obviously, again, he's 37 years old. He's never head coached in the NFL before, and this is the first and only time we've seen him get a chance to do this with the offense. So he hasn't done this anywhere else. So certainly there are questions with him. And if the Raiders decided to hire him, I would definitely be wanting to sit down with him and talk about his defensive coordinator choice. I wouldn't just let him come in and do anything. So we sit down and talk and say, well, who have you got in mind for DC? Because obviously you're not a defensive guy, and the Raiders have had a pretty bad defense the past couple of years, to put it mildly. What's your plan for that side of the ball? Because we really want you focused on the offensive side of the football so you can continue to make upgrades there for the Raiders on offense. So Ben Johnson, first choice. Kind of a short runway there for him with the Detroit Lions, but it's been marked. It's been obvious. Jared Goff's numbers from 2021 to 2022 jumped up a lot, and they've continued to be consistent in 2023. It's not the first time Jared Goff has played well and put up good offensive numbers. You remember that with the Rams, 4 or 5 years ago. They had just a tremendous offensive team during the regular season. So it's not the first time, but still, to watch Jared Goff, what looked like started to tail off there with his last year or two with the Rams and his first year with the Lions, and then boom, pick it right back up. Ben Johnson's got him and that entire offense playing very well. You can see the step back up. So I'm going to give Ben Johnson a lot of credit for that. And because of that, I really think the Raiders should be aggressive about going after Ben Johnson. Now, for those of you who are saying, well, the age is a little worrying. The fact that he hasn't done this for an extended period of time, that's a little worrisome. All true. So again, risk reward, got to assess that. But Johnson's the guy I would be looking at. Now, very close behind him, and I'm not even sure the more I think about it that I've got him behind, but very close after that is Eric Bieniemy, who is the offensive coordinator for the Washington Commanders. Obviously, Bieniemy's been kind of floated around as a head coaching candidate for several seasons now and just cannot seem to catch a break. And it's really irritating, especially watching guys like Josh McDaniels get their second go-around. And we've watched other guys who had a chance to be a head coach in the league and didn't do well. We watched them get a second chance somewhere else as a head coach. And Eric Bieniemy, just can't even seem to get his first shot at it. So that's particularly irritating, but I'm not going to dwell on that tonight. What I am going to say is that the Raiders should be looking just as hard at Eric Bieniemy as they did at Ben Johnson. Now listen, it's extremely easy to just kind of push Eric Bieniemy off to the side because he had Patrick Mahomes and he had Andy Reid, and Andy Reid has been an offensive guru with the Philadelphia Eagles for years and years and years, and then was able to duplicate a lot of that with Alex Smith in Kansas City. And then with Patrick Mahomes, it's kind of easy to say, well, Bieniemy had Mahomes and he had Andy Reid, and that's not untrue, of course. But when you watch Bieniemy working with Sam Howell this year for the Washington Commanders, and listen, Howell's throwing a lot of interceptions, but he's getting sacked at just a ridiculous rate, and yet still the Commanders are able to put up yardage. They're able to put up points. They're able to win football games. They're 4-5 at the time of this video. They've upset a couple of teams. A lot of that can be attributed to Eric Bieniemy. It sure isn't the defense for Washington that's creating those victories, because the defense has been atrocious, just absolutely horrible. So when you look at Eric Bieniemy, he's a guy, obviously got lots of experience, tons of experience all over the place. He's a guy that I recommended that at least 2 teams should have hired a couple of off seasons ago and this past off season, and they've just let him go. And I really think that the Raiders, if they can't or don't want to go down the route of Ben Johnson, I really think that the Raiders should be looking at Eric Bieniemy. Bieniemy is a guy I've been watching for a very long time. I can remember as a kid watching him play running back at Colorado back in the early 90s, just an incredible runner. And then he worked his way, he's paid his dues, like a lot of people, worked his way up through the coaching ladder, got a lot of attention there in Kansas City. And listen, he's there in Washington, and he's getting a lot of the same uptick in results here with a guy that was drafted in the 5th round. And a lot of people weren't even sure Sam Howell could or should be a starter. Bieniemy's working with that. And oh, by the way, it is an atrocious offensive line that they have there in Washington. And yet still we're seeing Bieniemy and Howell are able to move the football for fair amounts of yardage and fair amounts of points and giving their team a chance to win games. So I really recommend that the Raiders look at Ben Johnson and look at Eric Bieniemy. And that's my list right there. I'm going to go through some other guys here because, as always, you never know until you give a guy a chance, right? You never know about anybody until you give them a chance. But that's my list. Those are my 2 people. It's Ben Johnson and it's Eric Bieniemy. And there's a lot of work you got to do to support these guys when they come on board. But that's it. That's the list. And these people won't be available until the playoffs are over. But most of the coaches that you would look at wouldn't be available. Jim Harbaugh probably would, coming from the college ranks. But these NFL guys, they're really not going to be available until the playoffs are done. You might catch them for an interview or two a little bit before then, but certainly you're going to have to wait a while to catch them. But that's my list. 2 people, Ben Johnson, Eric Bieniemy. I like them both. The longer I've looked at it the past few weeks here, I've encouraged teams to hire Eric Bieniemy. I encourage the Raiders to do it. And listen, I just think either hire would be good, depending on which way you want to go. So, all right, what about some other names real quick? I'm going to zip through a few of them and just give you a general feel for it. Obviously, since I haven't recommended to put them on my 2-man list to make it a 3 or 4 person list, I'm not in favor of it. But still, there are other candidates out there, and some of you like them, and that's totally fine. So the first one that I'm going to come to is Dan Quinn. He's the defensive coordinator for the Dallas Cowboys. And listen, he's done an outstanding job there in Dallas. Nice to have Micah Parsons, but still you can see that Cowboys defense, with or without Parsons, has been good, but especially with Parsons, has just exploded on several levels. His name, Dan Quinn's name, comes up every offseason for another head coaching shot. And why not? Listen, he did okay when he was in Atlanta. We'll never forget the Super Bowl. He got them all the way to the Super Bowl that one year and then had just the crushing loss. I'm pretty sure that was Quinn that was coaching. I'm sorry if it's not. But anyway, yeah, it was. I'm going to pull that up here in a second. Sorry for jabbering on that. But anyway, you got Dan Quinn. He did a fair job there in Atlanta. But one reason that I wouldn't bring Quinn back in as a head coach is that the overall record there in Atlanta just wasn't great. And it was a pretty talented team. When you look back at the guys that were on that roster there in Atlanta, first year in Atlanta, he's 8-8. That's fine. It's first year. Second year, that was the Super Bowl year that they went and lost to the Patriots. They were still only 11-5 during the regular season. Then next year, 10-6, they lost in the playoffs to the Eagles. And then that's it. You had 2 7-9 seasons. They didn't even make the playoffs in those 2 years. And then he was going 0-5, and he got fired midway through the 2020 season. So I'm not against people hiring Dan Quinn, and certainly people improve. You know, we watched Bill Belichick obviously get a second chance. I'm not against people getting second chances. But when I have guys like Eric Bieniemy and Ben Johnson sitting there that I already like, I really don't want to reach back in and pull Dan Quinn out, at least not for the Raiders. That's just not what I want. And listen, I might say, well, a defensive guy coming in after Josh McDaniels' offensive, coordinator attempts at this might help. I get that. If you want the change of pace, you've got a guy who did at least get to a Super Bowl with the Falcons. It's just, for me, not the fit that I want. And again, I don't have any, Quinn wouldn't be I'd rather do Quinn than Harbaugh, to be honest about it, because Quinn's going to come in and he's not going to be full of drama or anything like that. But still, while I would recommend some teams to look at Dan Quinn, it's just not the guy that I would want there for the Raiders. Next, after that, the next guy I'm going to look at is, sorry, I'm getting the list mixed up here. is Minnesota Vikings defensive coordinator Brian Flores. Now listen, I like Brian Flores. I really do. I really didn't want the Dolphins to fire him. Looking back, since Mike McDaniel's done such a good job there, and since they've added so much talent, since that offense at times is just unstoppable, I'm not sure that it wasn't the right decision. But at the time, I did not want the Dolphins to let go of Brian Flores. Now, Brian Flores, when he was in Miami, had all kinds of drama going on too, and his exit was messy. So that by itself is reason enough to not bring him into the Raiders. But I would encourage teams all over the place to look at Brian Flores, just not the Raiders, okay? I don't want Brian Flores because, listen, he does his own thing. And maybe he can learn to do it better, but he does his own thing. And I love the attitude he brings, the uptick in defense, the aggressiveness in defense. I love all of that. And I think that he would make a good head coach somewhere. I really want to see Brian Flores get that second shot as a head coach. Just not with the Raiders. It just seems like a combustible mix, right? I mean, it just seems like that would be something, Flores to the Raiders, that would kind of blow up in everybody's faces. And so while I love the attitude and I love the aggression and I love his defensive mindset, and I really, really encourage teams, and I will bring them up during this offseason. I will specifically mention teams who should be looking at Brian Flores as a head coach. It's just not with the Raiders. And for some of the very reasons I said at the outset, the Raiders have had enough drama. They've had enough tension. They've had enough awkwardness. They've had enough bad things going on. Brian Flores had some of that going on there in Miami, whether it's his fault or not for me to say. Still, though, he had his part in that. And so I would not bring him to the Raiders simply because of that. So another name here that's going to come up on a lot of people's radars, and that is Cincinnati Bengals defensive coordinator Lou Anarumo. I can't tell you how impressed I've been with Lou Anarumo and his defenses in Cincinnati. It's the offense, it's Joe Burrow, it's Jamar Chase, it's T. Higgins, who get all of the attention there in Cincinnati, and rightfully so, because they are brilliant. They are absolutely brilliant. But the Bengals don't make a Super Bowl, and the Bengals don't make back-to-back playoffs if that Cincinnati defense isn't quietly doing all the damage that it's doing. And you look at them, they are well-disciplined, they are smart, they play hard, they play physical, the front line is good, the linebackers are good, the secondary plays well, even though sometimes, I think specifically this year at the safety positions, I think sometimes you can question the talent level back there, and I think that's legit. And yet still, the quiet calling card for this Bengals team has been that defense. And I cannot say enough good things about Lou Anarumo and his defenses there in Cincinnati. They're intelligent, they're physical, they play everything very well. You just don't usually see, it's extremely rare to see that defense get roasted any week. Now, you'll see them lose. And I don't ever think that they're an elite defense. I really don't think they've been a top 5 defense, in my opinion, over the past 3 seasons. But they have been remarkably good. They get better as the season goes along. And it has been that defense that has allowed the Bengals to win some rather closer, lower scoring games. So that even though the Bengals offensive line, which has been wretched for 3 seasons now, continues to be not very good in pass protection, it's just not. In spite of that, Joe Burrow and company, if they can score 24, 27 points, they can usually figure, unless they're playing a lit-up Chiefs offense, they usually figure they're going to win that game. And that's kind of been what we've seen over the years, of the past couple of seasons anyway, because this defense is so good. And so, listen, I like Lou Anarumo, but a couple of reasons I wouldn't want to bring him into the Raiders. He fits that professional bill. He fits all of those quiet things that I would encourage the Raiders to look for. So I'm not against that. I like the idea. He would be maybe 3 or 4 on the list. But I really want to see the Raiders bring in an offensive guy. I want to see them light it up. It's going to take a while to get that Raiders defense built back up. I don't think it would take us long for a Ben Johnson or an Eric Bieniemy to get that Raiders offense, because you already have Devontae Adams. The offensive line wasn't as bad this year as it has been the past couple of years. It's a work in progress. You get a little bit more help there, and then you start adding weapons, especially Ben Johnson. I love Ben Johnson's creativity. You keep giving him weapons, but Eric Bieniemy, the same thing. You give him more and more weapons to work with. And I think most importantly, you give them a mobile quarterback with a big arm, and that allows them to just open up the entire playbook. Even if they're not the most accurate quarterback, you can open up the entire playbook. And you don't necessarily, if you hire Bieniemy or if you hire Ben Johnson, and if you have that quarterback with big arm and mobility, doesn't have to be a first-round guy necessarily, although it's fine if it is. What that does, it allows you to continue to develop that offensive line over the next 2 or 3 seasons, and you don't feel pressured to all of a sudden have a top-notch offensive line there like you do when you have Garoppolo or even Aiden O'Connell in the building. That really starts to open up a lot of things. So if you bring in the defensive coordinator, Lou Anarumo, now all of a sudden you kind of figure, man, we've got to get this offensive line going. We've really got to invest more in the offense all across the board and the defense at the same time. Because one thing we're seeing here, if you've got a good offense in the NFL, let's say a top 8-10 offense, you can win your fair share of games. Unlike, listen, good defense, I love it, but you really need to have a top 3 defense to be good enough to make up for a bad offense in the NFL. It's just the way it's tilted right now. If you can get that elite defense to go along with a game manager, quarterback, and a running game and all of that, that's great. But the Raiders just don't really feel like they're wired that way right now. So I would tilt toward offensive guy coming in as head coach. We'll patch the defense together the best we can. But let's go ahead and get some more points scored in here. And maybe that would encourage Davante Adams to want to stay as well. It's fine if they don't go that way. For those of you that want to go a different direction, that's fine as well. But that would be the direction I would want to go in as well. So, all right, there's other people. USC head coach Lincoln Riley. I'm not going to say Lincoln Riley can't coach in the NFL, man, or can't be an offensive coordinator in the NFL, but he's just been a boatload of drama himself for when he was in Oklahoma, when he exited Oklahoma, ever since he's been at SoCal. He's got a good offensive mind. There's no question about it. He's got the ability to do lots of things on offense, and yet I'm going to question some of the head coaching abilities. I'm going to question the ability to build a defense. I'm going to question the ability to build an offensive and defensive line. And I'm going to question the fact that he hasn't done this at the NFL level. So I personally would stay away from Lincoln Riley. I just would not bring him in. Other people, really quick, offensive coordinator Kellen Moore for the Los Angeles Chargers wouldn't be bad. And then from there, it really starts to peter out. So, okay, that's it for today. I appreciate everybody listening. I've got content all over the place. You can check it out. We're on several podcasts. I may give them to you out in the future. But for today, that's enough. I appreciate it. Have a great one.